All right, everybody, how you doing? My name is Bill Manning. We're going to be starting in a second. Everybody get settled in, and I think we're ready to go. So today, we're going to talk today about Zen and the art of NPM artifacts. I'm assuming that a lot of you guys out there are NPM developers. I'm hoping, and we're going to be talking about a couple different things today, and I'll go through that in a minute with the agenda. But I just want to make sure that you guys are all somewhat familiar with the way we handle what Artifactory is, how we handle artifacts, how we handle builds, and things like that. We're going to go through a demonstration. I'm going to show you using the standard npm install method to accomplish what you need. And I'm also going to show you the power of using the JFrog CLI and what that brings also. And also we'll discuss things like security and other components behind npm and Artifactory itself. So the first thing we're going to do is, like I said, I'm Bill Manning. My job here is I'm a solution engineer or a solution architect. I work with our customer base and I work with the community on ensuring that we provide the best solution possible, especially for NPM and all the other various packages we do. I've been with the company for almost 2 years now. And it's really amazing how many people out there actually use what we do. So today we're going to talk about what is Artifactory, what kind of pain does it solve, also to how you can utilize it for developing your own NPM projects. Also to how it works, how to integrate into your developer organization, and also to I'm just going to provide some useful tips and hints and things like that. I'm going to show you also how we do a build, and in this case, Jenkins for my CI integration. And let's get started. Of course, the picture to the right is pretty much very applicable to every situation. With npm, you do an npm install, and you watch all those transitive dependencies flow into place. That's where really what Artifactory comes about. So it looks like I already have somebody. Now, I am going to make some assumptions here that we do have some experience with Artifactory. Artifactory itself is the universal binary repository manager. And the idea behind it is that we provide, what I always say to customers is we provide consistency. And that means that, where you have GitHub or GitLab, any of the products where you want to store your, any sort of VCS, anywhere you want to store your source code, you use, a source control management, we handle the binaries. So we handle all those dependencies. Now we have over 27 package types that are available for usage, and then we also have a generic repository that you can store things that really don't fit the mold in this case. And I mentioned Artifactory. It's kind of the main basis behind what JFrog is. And what we do is that we allow you to have that consistency of method from the time of your development all the way down to distribution. I have a couple other webinars out there that we've done with the company. One's called 5Ps. I recommend going to take a look at that. It's all about using our promotion API and how do you actually promote builds through the system. And we're going to kind of slightly touch on that today. What the things is that you're looking to do is maybe you're looking to supercharge your CI, or you're looking for a better way to improve your development tactics, especially in terms of NPM. So I'm making sure that all your developers across the organization are using the same npm modules to perform the tasks. On top of that, we're also going to discuss Xray for a bit. Xray is our security vulnerability tool, and I'll handle more of the security aspects towards the end. Also, too, I want to make sure that you have a basic understanding of what DevOps is and what DevOps isn't. So, DevOps was actually implemented as a way for organizations to unify the prospects of having development all the way down to their operational, so this way you can automate as much as possible. I also recommend going out there and reading things like 12 factors. I love 12-factor development application styles. The idea of having that unity between the developer and the end product for that, that method, and really Artifactory is a really huge component when utilizing things like 12 factors for your development. And going through this, I want to talk about dependency management, build management too, because in NPM land, one of the things that's nice about it is, yes, the dependencies are great. I'm an NPM developer by trade. I built 2 companies prior to joining JFrog using NPM because I thought it was the best method for it. I was utilizing the web services portion on top of the user interface. Even ourselves here internally, we use actually Angular 2 as the user interface for our products, all powered by a Java backend. But really what it is you want to go through and automate. So with Artifactory, you're getting a consistency, utilizing the binaries. Xray, which I guess that we'll talk about too, you also get the idea of actually making sure that all those third-party dependencies that you utilize for your projects are safe, secure, even down to license governance, just as an FYI. You can even, a lot of corporations, fintech and medtech, have a lot of rules around how you can utilize third-party open source libraries based strictly on liability from license compliance. So one of the things that I want to talk about is just the things we'll discuss today is, you have the developer to your left. He checks his code in his source code. He has a CI system that performs the build to release his products. You can use Artifactory through the entire pipeline. I always say that it's kind of like a conveyor belt. So you have your developers developing, and when they pass it off to the CI, Artifactory ensures that the binaries they're utilizing in the CI environment are the same binaries the developers use, so you don't get that whole "it works on my machine." It falls in line with the 12 factors approach. And then Xray is actually bootstrapped off to the side of that. It's a very symbiotic relationship between the two products. And when I discuss Xray, I always say that it's a clean room. It's its own separate product. It pulls in the binaries. It takes them apart, dissects them, diagnoses them, and then keeps a record of them so that as new vulnerability data comes in, you're able to enact upon it to make sure that everything is secure in your environment. Last thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to briefly, just for a moment, is our bin tray product, which is actually our distribution platform. And the distribution platform is built on Akamai CDN, and it integrates into JFrog Artifactory and allows you to produce binaries and distribute them out globally and in a safe and secure method. Bin tray is actually used for a lot of open source projects too. If you've ever used Homebrew on, say, like your Mac or anything like that, that's actually being hosted by bin tray. If you're a Maven developer, JCenter, that's actually hosted on bin tray, and a few others. And we, to this day, we serve it up about average like 3.5 to 4 billion downloads a month. So just keep that in mind. So, first thing I wanted to talk about is this is more along the methodologies that I always like to talk to customers about and talk live about is, and like I said, my 5 Ps webinar has a whole hour on this. But really, when you go into development cycles, it's very simple, right? You have features, sprints, you plan your releases, you do bug fixes, you distribute, and you go through the whole cycle again, right? It's the typical DevOps plan. It's just the way it works. And Artifactory is, like I said, is a major portion of this that it all falls in line with. And when you think about this and you think about NPM development, myself personally, when I built my second company before I joined JFrog, we were very limited in the scope of what we had for developers. So Artifactory was actually, we used the SaaS offering as a way for us to automate as much as possible. And as I mentioned before, we would go through these steps ourselves, but when you're very limited, we would spend more time. I want to spend more time on innovation and less time on development release cycles and basically the plumbing underneath that, ensuring that my web service went from my developers through the CI, that they were unit tested, they were regression tested, that they were scanned for vulnerabilities, and then also released. And that really falls in line with the standard DevOps mentality. And I mentioned before that if you're really interested in different practices that I personally follow by, and a lot of others I know work with, then I talked about 12 factors. And when you're developing a node application, the thing is that whenever you run a standard node, I'm going to show you an example that we provide to our customer base that has a node front end that's being deployed into a Docker container. And then that Docker container is actually being deployed via Kubernetes, which is a very standard practice. And a lot of that actually I utilized in my previous life, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit here. I'm going to be concentrating more on the functionality aspect of the developer, but I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of background. So like when I talk about 12 factors, really what it comes down to is these are the 2 key components of 12 factors that Artifactory really steps in, right? So the idea of limiting the difference between development and production for continuous deployment, and that's through your CI and then whatever you have for your end goal, like whether you're deploying it as a container in a Kubernetes pod, utilizing a node project. The whole idea of build, run, release really allows you to do that. And Artifactory and our product lines are like the conveyor belt that's really an enabler to make sure that, like I said, you can focus more on production. One of the other things we're going to talk about in this example too is I'm also going to talk about how to utilize binary management, especially in terms of Artifactory, and using the repository structure to enable a producer-consumer model. Now, when I say producer-consumer, that could be a multitude of different things. Developers for developers, right? So I have teams that may create an authentication module that is utilized in another team. Well, I don't want to have to always constantly go through and pull the project and do things like that. What if I was able to actually put those binaries in my resolution path, but do it automatically so that I always have the latest version that's stored in Artifactory, and by default, I'm always utilizing it from the other team. And we're going to talk a little bit about repository design and things like that, and then we're going to build a project. We're going to talk about the tools that are involved and the various methods you can implement this. But really, I want you to think about producers and consumers. And we're going to talk about repositories. And like I said, I'm actually keeping my slides very short because I want to focus more on practical. But let's talk about repos. So, or I'll say repos, repositories, whatever nomenclature you decide you want to utilize for your organization, but it's very simple. And Artifactory organizes these in very particular methods. So we have local repositories, and I'm going to show you and talk about local repositories. And local repositories are your builds, your binaries, things that you generate. This is the stuff you store. So if you're doing Maven builds, you can use us to store your Docker containers as a secure Docker registry. You can store your NPM builds. Now that's one of the things we're going to focus on today. The thing is with NPM builds, in a standard practice, you do your build, you publish it, you package it up into the chargez, and then you ship it off somewhere. Well, in this case, I'm going to show you the benefits of doing that in a normal aspect, and then I'm going to show you an enhanced method utilizing the JFrog CLI tool, which provides you with much more. Now, you have remote repositories. This is the next thing we're going to discuss. Those are your third-party libraries. So those are your node modules. Those are your Java jar files that you depend on, Python packages, NuGet, whatever. And those are the libraries that you can ensure that if you set up your repository structures correctly, can be shared amongst your team. So if I have Bob the developer download, say, a package that solves a layout issue or something that it might be in the product, when I go to build it, if I'm, say Tom the developer, when Tom pulls and does an install and he's using that repository structure, it's not going out to the internet. It's actually just pulling it from Artifactory because those third-party libraries are stored. And if I use that in conjunction with something like, say, Xray, I can ensure the safety and security behind that. And actually, before I jump into, into actually the examples, I'm going to talk about two use cases where this was glaringly apparent. And the last thing I want to discuss in repositories is virtual repositories. I don't want to have a project with 25, 30 repos sitting there. So I have a virtual repository, and I'm going to show you how to construct a virtual repository that will allow me to go through and utilize what I said before, which is that producer-consumer model. And this is actually the place where it's a combination of local and remote. And you could also have other repositories and other virtual repositories be part of that also. Now let's talk about remote repositories. We're going to take a step back and talk about third-party libraries. Now, I'm going to talk about two use cases here. So the first use case I'm actually going to discuss is if you were around in March 2016, you know the nightmare that happened when there was a disgruntled NPM developer who made a very simple project called LeftPad. Now, LeftPad does exactly what it says, and here's the code right here, right? It's 11 lines of code, very simple, but he got disgruntled. He got very angry and decided to remove his account and take his binaries home with him. Well, about 43% of the sites on the internet that were using their CI process and build process started failing when that dependency wasn't there. And the reason why is they kept going externally to the internet to npm.js and trying to pull it, and they were getting back, getting back an error saying that it was unavailable. Now, customers that were using Artifactory did not have this issue because they had a cached version. So the remote repository caches that version of the binary so it can be utilized again and again and again. And we store multiple versions of it if you pull in multiple versions. So you can keep 4 or 5 different versions. So if you need to replay a previous, say, build or something, you're not going to have to go out there and scope the internet. You're actually just going to have a pull from Artifactory. So I want to keep this very succinct and brief in this case. So I want to go to the next part, which is the demonstration. So give me a second here to stop sharing my screen. And while I'm doing that, one of the things that I want to discuss is I'm going to show you a little bit of Artifactory, and we're going to discuss how to utilize Artifactory in a pure method. And I'm also going to show you some other pieces that we have here. And, but I just discussed LeftPad. I mean, that was from 2016. It's a very standard thing. But even this morning, I went through and just decided to check for the last week to look at vulnerabilities. Here's one here, right? Here's a critical vulnerability that was actually found on the 4th, so it was found yesterday, which involved Kubernetes and node hacking, right? Here's one that I found here, and I went through Cisco. I found a parser issue. This one was actually from yesterday also, from yesterday evening. Here's another one, right? So how do you ensure that those third parties that you're pulling from actually fall in line with your corporation's or your project's stringent security methods, right? So there's a lot of, it's constantly happening. So what I talked about before with consistency, the LeftPad example was a perfect example of this because of the fact that it was removed from the internet, removed from, out there in the world. But if you had Artifactory as your repository manager, you'd be fine. And if you use that in conjunction with Xray, well, these vulnerabilities can be determined and found. And we're going to do a demonstration of Xray in a bit. And the Xray version I'm going to show you actually in this case is a very standard kind of thing. But I'm going to show you how finding a vulnerability deeply embedded inside of, like, say, something in a container that might be even hosting your node project can be susceptible. Something that you pull together as a hosting unit and looking at and finding the components that are inside. Now, one of the things I'm going to show you quickly is, and because we're going to come back to it, is I'm going to bring up my Jenkins server. And in my Jenkins server, the thing that I'm working on right now is actually I have a tutorial that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to show the example, especially in terms of vulnerabilities in this case. And if you look here, I've got a very standard practice here of like a Gradle backend. I've got a Node.js front end. I've got my container. I have my Helm chart dynamically being built and put together. And we're using we have a platform called Enterprise Plus. So we're creating a thing called a mutable release bundle. And then we're distributing it out to a Kubernetes service. Now, what does this all have in common? Why am I talking about this in the Node webinar? Well, simply put is, this is a very standard web service being deployed in Kubernetes. And the entire way in which I'm doing this, I'm actually using Artifactory from top to bottom. So I'm storing my Gradle app. I'm storing my Node front end. I'm actually constructing the container and storing that in Artifactory using the 2 previous steps. I'm actually creating the Helm chart based on the data above that. So in other words, Artifactory can actually supercharge your pipeline for building and deploying of web services. So let's go look at Artifactory. I'm not going to do a full demonstration of what Artifactory is. I'm going to talk about the essential components. So I mentioned before, as I said, this is actually an Angular 2 application that's actually being stored. That's actually presenting our API. So you can utilize our API or our CLI. You're not limited to our user interface. But I want to show you is a very visible demonstration. So let's talk about the main essential pieces here, right? So let's talk about repositories. I've already created a repository for the actual command line demonstration I'm going to do, but I'm going to show you the producer-consumer model. So let's do this. Let's create repositories. Now, in a perfect world, you would actually follow like my 5 Ps that I described, if you want to look at that. But you should design your repository structure, especially your local repository structure, around your CI, actually your processes. So you should have a dev repository. You should have a testing repository. a staging repository, a release repository, a production repository. And we have an API that allows you to take these builds you produce that you store in Artifactory and actually move them from one silo to another. And by doing that, it actually helps you with a lot of different things. And it provides you with a system of record. It provides you with a ledger of each one of these releases and the phases in which it's utilized. Now, Artifactory uses a checksum-based storage. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it's an essential component of what we do. And the essential component there is we do not allow duplication. And because it's that way, you have your physical binary, and then you have a metadata layer that actually represents that binary. And because you're doing that, and if say you use the promotion API, you can also instill other properties that are relevant to your organization, meaning that you can actually enhance and improve the amount of data that you're using for your decisions. Now, in my case, I'm actually going to create a new NPM repository. I'm going to select it here, and I'm going to say test NPM, and I'm going to say auth team, and I'm going to say prod. Because what I'm going to do is, in this case, they might have a dev repo, they might have a staging, but I'm going to focus right now on my prod repo. Now, I'm not going to put anything into this actual repository right now, but I want to show you the purpose behind it, because I'm going to show you my project that I'm going to demonstrate, but I'm going to enhance my project by showing this on. So let's do this. I'm going to say enable Xray integration because I want to scan it just to make sure it's safe and secure. So let's save that. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create for that team a remote repository. But in this case, I've already got one. So I actually have a remote repository defined here, meaning that any time that the NPM modules are being pulled, they're being stored and cached in here. And if you look, it says, here's registry.npmjs.org. So I'm actually going to use this as my company repository where I want to store those third-party dependencies. Now, I'm going to create a virtual repository for that team, my auth team, right? They write all the authentication modules that work with OAuth. It does all the credential validation. It does all the user validation and profiles. But I want to integrate it into my new application. So let's do this. I'm going to say test npm. I'm going to say auth team, and I'm going to say prod, and I'm going to say virtual. So I'm going to create a virtual repository. I'm going to grab their local repository that I have here. Here's my npm remote repository that I have, and let's store that. But every time they do a build, I'm going to deploy this into my production repo. Now, let's save and finish that. So I've now created a virtual repository for my authentication team to include their authentication modules that I can reference via my package.json. Now, I'm going to show you for this demonstration, I've created a virtual repository in 3 local. So I'm going to show you the one I'm using here is my test npm virt. So this is the one you'll see me reference when I'm working in my environment here. And if you look, it actually has my npm local where I'm going to be doing my deployment. I have my remote that I'm doing where I'm testing that. But now I'm going to include that team with mine. So here's that test npm prod, but I'm going to grab the virtual repository in this case. Now let's select that. Let's copy it over. And now I'm going to change the resolution order. So I changed the resolution order. So if I'm looking for those modules in my npm package, it'll actually go here and grab their production modules, right? So it'll grab those production modules that I want to utilize for my project. And at the bottom, you can see when I do my builds that these are actually being produced and used locally. So let's save that. Now, I'm going to actually share, I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I'm going to be going back and forth between my 2 screens. Let's go back out to my Artifactory dashboard for a specific reason. So let's do this. Let me share. I'll share my desktop. Let's see here. Share. And here's my Artifactory instance again. And let's go take a look at my project for a moment. So if you look here, I'm inside my shell like I would normally do. I have a very simple project right here. It does nothing really terribly exciting. I'm not even going to bother showing you what it does. But first thing I want to do is I'm actually going to remove my npm modules, the ones that I've already, the node modules that I've done, because I want to start from scratch. So let's do that. So if I take a look at my project again, you can see that my packages are gone. Now, let's go implement it so that I can utilize it. So the first method in which I'm going to utilize Artifactory as my repository for this, I'm going to use standard npm. So you can utilize npm, and I'm going to show you how to do that and what you can do with it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to show you how to use our CLI tool, which is my preferred method. And the reason why is there's a lot of enhanced features behind it. So let's click on here. So one of the things that we have with Artifactory is this. So if you set up your repositories, we have very simple instructions on how to utilize Artifactory for this usage. We give you the generalized instructions. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this right here, and I'm going to say, I want to utilize Artifactory as my npm registry. So I simply go in here, I paste it in, and now Artifactory is my default npm registry when I'm doing this. But the first thing I need to do is I need to go do an npm login. So when I do that, before I hop in and do that, I'm actually going to do one thing. So I'm going to say npm login, and it's going to ask me for my username. Part of my usage of actually doing something, we're using admin, but I'm using it for demonstration purposes. And it's going to prompt me for my password. In Artifactory, what you can actually do is go into your profile, unlock this, and you can actually grab your encrypted password, which I have here. Let's go back. Let's paste it in, hit enter, and I'm just going to say admin at jfrog.com. It's not real, but whatever. Now I'm logged into Artifactory. Now I can actually just do a standard npm install. And it's going to go through, and actually what it's doing right now is it actually added those packages, and it actually pulled those from Artifactory. If I go back into Artifactory, and let's go take a look here, and we'll say test npm, if I could type. And if you look down here, you can see I actually have my remote cache. I have all my stuff set up. Well, let's take a look at my virtual for a second. And you can see where I've actually pulled in a whole bunch of extra artifacts. Okay, so I've actually proxied those through. And that's great. You know what? That's fantastic. Let's go back in and take a look for a moment. I can go in here now and click in here again. If I wanted to actually publish, I could actually do, if I want to publish this, say to Artifactory, I just click npm publish, go back in, let's paste it in, and now I'm actually publishing that into it. So I actually, I already have a build there, so I needed to change the version, didn't do that. I'm not going to go and change it right now, but if I went in, it already says that there's a version there. If I wanted to, I could actually go in and change that. We can do that right now. JSON, and let's change the version number over to 1.1. Let's save it. And let's try publishing that again. There we go. And now I've actually gone in and published that version into Artifactory. Now that would actually, if I go to take a look into my virtual that I have here, you can see where I actually npm vert. Let's find that. And we go under here. Let's take a look. It's another test, and there you go. So actually, but the thing is, that's pretty anemic. There's really not a lot there. Let's supercharge it. All right. So when I say supercharge it, let's get the same effect, but I'm going to show you what the difference is. So instead of utilizing what I have, we're actually going to, I'm going to use my history in this case, because I'm going to show you. I've run this a couple times. And, you know, the thing is that you can go in, and let's, in this case, I'm just going to copy this line that I have right here. And let's grab that. And let's paste that in here. Let's Control A. But in this case, I'm actually going to do an npm install. I'm going to change the build number in this case. If you look here, I've got build name and build number. And let's do this. So now I'm running an npm install. But here's the thing, is that really you didn't see much there, right? Let's remove the artifacts again, just because I can. And let's do this. First of all, I was able to use our JFrog CLI tool, and I want to kind of start off by saying that. So our JFrog CLI, you can download. It's a way for you to interact with Artifactory, bin tray, mission control, Xray, all of our suite of products from the command line. If you feel more comfortable living in a shell, this is the perfect example for that. So the first thing I'm going to show you is I'm going to connect my Artifactory server, and config is C or config is the option. But I'm going to show you I actually am connected to two separate Artifactory instances. I have an instance that I run with my team, and then I have my personal Artifactory instance in this case. So when you see a server.id equals, and I'm putting local-RT, that means that I'm actually connecting to my Artifactory instance that's mine. And now that I have this here, I'm going to do that npm install again this time, right? So we'll do this. I know the build numbers don't match, so maybe what we'll do is let's do this. Let's match the build numbers in this case. So let's do package.json, and I'm going to change that to 1.2. Just so it matches what I'm trying to do. Actually, we'll do 1.3, because I think I already published 1.3 and 1.2. So let's do this. Let's save it. Let's call back that same line that I wrote, right? So let's make this 1.3 so it matches. Now let's do an npm install using the CLI. If you look here, you can see that I've actually produced an entire string of all the dependencies that are being pulled in and where they're being utilized and stored, including version numbers and everything. You can export this out, and since it's simple JSON, this is a good way for you to keep record. Now, that's not the only magic that we have here. If we go back in, one of the things that I'll share with you guys afterwards is I'll actually share with you my GitHub project, and my GitHub project explains all this information right here on how we're doing things. But the next steps we're going to be going through in this case is I'm going to show you, first of all, how to basically add Git information into the project. I'm going to show you how to collect all the environmental variables. Have you ever wanted to know how your node packages were constructed? This is how you do it. And then the next thing I'm going to do publish again, but this time I'm actually going to publish all the build information from npm into Artifactory. And then lastly, I'm going to actually publish the actual build itself, and I can store that build somewhere so I'm not always reconstructing it. So if you look at the project that I have here, you can see I've actually run this before. So let's go in and look at my history again, and let's run the same things that we're doing here. So let's go let's look at my the piece I have here. So this time we're going to do is we're going to do RTBAG, and then we're going to give it the name of the test. So let's go back. So we're going to say here JFrog. Sorry, here we go. JFrog RT, and we're going to say BAG. Let's grab the name of the project we have here, and then let's also grab the build number that we have here. There we go. And we run it, and now we've collected it. Next thing we're going to do is collect the environmental variables. So let's change that over to BCE. Now, as I'm doing this, by the way, just so you know, you can also automate all these features and functions. So there you go. Now we collected the build information. Last thing we're going to do in this case before we jump in and do the next piece. So let's take this same build. Now let's publish this to Artifactory. So I'm running a publish command. So I've now published it there. And last thing what we're going to do in this case is now I'm going to do a build publish. I want to show you the results of that. So before, where that was slightly anemic, there we go. Nope. I can't publish it right now. That's not a good thing. But I'll show you the previous version because we're running out of time. I purposely to the wrong place. Sorry, that's my bad. Let's go back in and change that again. The reason why I had to do that is we need to grab this command right here, and let's add that at the end. And now it's successfully built and deployed. That was my problem. That was actually a syntactical error that I did. But let's go in. And if you look on the page here, I have the latest builds. Let's click on it, and there we go. Here's build 103 that I've stored. Now, why is this important? Because if I click in here, you can see this is the build that I created. And if you take a look, you can see here's the file that was actually produced, right? And I can click on that if I wanted to and show you where it is. I can show you all the NPM information that's around it, all its dependencies and records. I can change the permissions. I actually have this enabled. I'm not actually scanning it currently, but I'll show you how you can implement that. Let's go back and look at the NPM build again. So here's build 103. But also too, in this list, I have all the dependencies, right? Here's all the dependencies I had for that build. I can show you all the environmental variables. Of course, this was built on my Mac, so I have all the information that's around this. If I have a Jira system, I can hook up a Jira ticketing system to it, and I can put those issues in so they're associated to that build. Once again, that system of record. I can look at all the licensing that's behind this. So I can tell you every license that's involved in building this NPM project. I can export it if I have a governance team that wants to know this information. And lastly, one of my favorite features is I can actually go in if I wanted to, and then I can do a diff actually between the two different builds. So you can see where actually I've gone in. I've only changed one file in this case, but you can see here's all the dependencies. And then I can also look at all the key system and environmental variables behind it. So if I'm looking to go through and provide some sort of remediation behind it, I actually have a good starting point, a point for me to jump in and look at. Now, I mentioned before, that if I wanted to have this as part of my build process, I have other builds that I've created, where I showed you, where I've got this Jenkins job that I created that creates my Kubernetes web service. And if you look in here, I'll look at the Docker app for a moment. And if you take a look at the Docker app, here's all the layers that were produced by it. Here, in this case, are those dependencies. So here's those two other builds that I produced. And those are stored in Artifactory. I now have a complete system of record. And it has all the same functionality behind it, but there's one key difference in this case. So the difference is that part of my job that I did here that pulls those dependencies, that does that build, that does that, is a step called promote. So I actually have a call to our promotion API in this case. And the promotion API allows me to go in and promote that artifact. And one of the things I have here is my release history. And if you look here, you can see where I've actually taken this job. It's passed my tests, it's being promoted out, and it's been released. I have a system of record there. And you can do the same thing that you want to do. You can promote your build artifacts. I can promote that node project that I just created, and I can do it all from inside the command line and navigate that way. And that allows me to go through and do these builds and these dependencies and have them all in one location, have a system of record that I can abide by. Now, in terms of how would I automate this, I'll show that in a minute. So let's talk about the second job here. This is a example of how you can automate an NPM package build. And what does that look like? Well, let's go take a look at the way that would look here. And here's a job. Here it is. This is a straight job that I have, right? So I'm cloning the project down. I'm using the CLI in this case. We actually have a plugin for Jenkins. In the next example I have here, where I was talking about utilizing the promotion API, here's a build where I'm actually building that Docker container. And if you look at the bottom, you can see where I have that promote API, right? So I can say, take it from its source repository, maybe staging, and move it up into my production repository. And here, if I want to scan it for anything nefarious, and I'll show you the results of that, I can scan that entire container and look for anything that might cause an issue. But if you look here, I'm actually creating that node package, and I'm automating all those steps right here, utilizing all this functionality. And I'll supply this as for examples. This is all available for people to look at. But I'm using that same sort of aspect that I showed you in the command line inside of Jenkins. And what does that look like? So if I were actually to take this and build this as we're talking, it's a pretty quick build. And what this will show you is that I'm able to automate all my NPM projects through Jenkins and utilize all those pieces that I have and store them in a central spot. So this way, I'm ensuring that my builds are consistent, that I have that methodology where I'm not going through and doing something that might cause a problem. And I can have a record from top to bottom on that. So this will be done in a minute. And when it's done, let's go take a look. So this is build number 697. Let's go back to my dashboard. And if you look here, here's build 697. So I've actually gone through and actually created that build, and I automated it. Now I actually have a record that I can go through and utilize. I'm going to take a step to the next part right here, and I want to discuss actually, before we start answering questions, I've got about 6-7 minutes left before we start asking questions. I want to show you Xray quickly. So let's take a look at my remote repository for a minute. I've got a couple in here. I'm going to show you a complex example, but I want to show you how simple it is to actually implement Xray scanning. So here's that remote repository that I have. And at the bottom of it, one of the things I have is, this will show up if I have Xray attached to my Artifactory instance. And what it says is enable indexing in Xray. Well, here's Xray. Now, I'm not going to do a very detailed analysis of what Xray is, but Xray allows you to create things called policies, right? So actually, I need to go. Watches. So I mean, watches are a way for you to go through and manage resources. And what I can do is these resources, I can attach them to like all repositories, all builds, or even this very separate individual sort of builds that you might have, right? Or repositories themselves. And then you apply policies. Now, policies come in two flavors. I kind of want to show, so they're either security or licensing. A security violation is based on CVE score, so we get our data from a bunch of different sources and we deliver it to the product, or a range of CVE scores. And then picture this as being like an if statement, a conditional. And the next is the then. So I can trigger a webhook to a third-party product. I can notify by email. Now, in terms of that remote repository, I can say block download or block unscanned artifacts. So one of the biggest problems that a lot of organizations have is how much restriction you place upon your developer before you start squashing innovation and actually start focusing on security. It's a very fine line. By utilizing Xray for this, you can actually, at the front line of defense with the developer, you can block those artifacts from being utilized until they've been scanned. And if they've been scanned and they don't work or they don't meet your criteria, they'll get an error saying that it's not available. They get a 404. If I have this connected to a CI system, I can actually send a CI termination event. Now that's just for security. Now I have licensing also. I have the same set of conditionals, right, that I could do here, the same kind of actions, but I could also say these are my allowed licenses, these are my banned licenses, and then also FinTech and medical ask for this request, which is disallow unknown licenses. And you'd be surprised actually how many licenses out there, products out there, third-party dependencies don't have licensing and that are actually proper. And once again, perform the same tasks. But let me show you an extreme example of this, like how this benefits you as a developer. And in this case, I'm going to focus on the actual container that I have that looks at every time I actually put a new container into Artifactory, I scan. So let's take a look at how many violations. And I'll tell you, 11,444 violations it's found. It's a tremendous amount because my containers are horrible. But let's click in and let's look at one of the examples that we have here. And one of the examples might be this, like here you go. If you look, this actually did a deep level packet scan of an entire Docker container. It actually found an issue inside of a jar, inside of a layer, inside of a build, inside of a job. So if we click in that, we produce a component graph. And we can do this for, by the way, all the other, other package types that we have. And if you look, here's all the violations. Here's the security problems that are arisen. Here's the license, so I can tell you exactly which license this is part of. I can also, from a remediation standpoint, show you every other affected repository because of the way that Artifactory stores binaries. Now, let's go look at that same example again, but I want to show one layer deeper, right? So with the one layer deeper that I have here, I'll show you the entire container. Now, how many times you're a developer, if you have a security or governance team, have they asked you for, what licenses are available and, what licenses are being utilized? Now, Docker containers can be massive. It can be small 100, 200 megs, depending if you're using Alpine and stuff that you might want to deploy, up to gigabytes, right? Depending on how complex. We have a lot of customers that utilize this feature, and automating this allows you to have that extra step. Yes, there's other tools out there. There's tools that do source code, but we handle the binaries, the dependencies. And if you look, here's the violations again, security, but look at the licensing, right? So the licensing in this aspect, I can show you every license of every piece that's inside of that container. But I mentioned before that we show, talking about unknown licenses. If you look, there's a whole bunch of licenses that, packages that don't have licenses in there. Now, the same thing with location, but here's a big thing. How many times have you ever wondered what actually lives inside those layers, inside of your Docker containers or even your node packages? Well, here you go. Here's all those here's everything that's stored in those layers, every jar file. Actually, in this one, I believe, in one of these, we find it. You can actually see where I actually have the node the node instances. Wow, there's a lot of stuff in here. I should have shut that one down. But you can see here you go. Like here's like jQuery. Here's all those pieces for that node project, right? So these are all the ones that I have, and I can see them exactly where they're located. So this all ties in together. Now, like I said, utilizing JFrog, Artifactory, our CLI tool, really allows you to wrangle in and actually, have NPM, which is already a powerful medium and one of my favorite mediums to develop in. But now having the accountability, the consistency, the security that a lot of other languages and stuff and development methods have, well, you can have them too in a very simple, easy to deploy format. Now, let me go back and do one more thing. Okay, and I think that's all I've got. Yeah, thank you. That's the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions, we have a few minutes, and now would be the time for me to answer.